Uh, Hello there. Today I am going to learn you how to make this effect in Godot. So, yeah, I guess let's get started. So, I've prepared this pretty standard scene. This is not going to be sort of as easy as the other stuff that I've made. There is like a little more steps involved, but it's not that hard really. So I've basically just prepared this like basic scene. You don't actually have to do this, but I just made it so it's a little easier to tell what's going on. There's just a floor with a texture. Uh, I'll get to this in a second. There's some lighting as you can see over here, and I've just put like this background, like this panorama image. That's about it. There is only one thing you will have to do, and that is you'll need somewhere in your scene. I assume you already have a world environment node, but if you don't, you gotta make one, set it up however you want, and enable glow because we need like that explosion sort of bloom effect and stuff. And that'll only be visible if you have glow enabled. So yeah. The reason I say this is not so straightforward is because it's not like you can just drag and drop a shader and it's just gonna work. There's like particles that you have to make and a few other things to sort of get it to look nice and the way you want it to. But the basic principle is that we're using these three textures. You don't have to make these, I'll just give these to you on GitHub. Like you can go down to the description, you'll find a link to the GitHub repository. So you have these three textures, and I'll sort of explain what these are. So they're going to be named like red. This is going to be called red. This will be called green, and this will be called blue texture. I named them this way just because I didn't actually want to give them real names, and I was initially planning on combining these into one texture, but I couldn't get that to work, so I just kept them split as three. Um, you may already be able to tell what's going on here, but essentially we're using this as our smoke. This is going to be our fire, and this is going to be our mask, but all of this is going to happen in one particle effect. And so the main sort of juice of this entire effect comes from this one particle right here, right? So it's a pretty simple particle effect. I'll just hide all this so we can start from the beginning. So I've set it to about 64. You can go as high or low as you want. Maybe under here I'll disable one shot just to show you what this is like. So this is what the particle effect looks like. And what we're gonna do is, like, if you want, you could go crazy, like 512 to create like an insane amount of particles, but I think 64 is like just about enough to get you going. This is like the basic effect. This is the basis for sort of everything, right? The rest are sort of just add on to the explosion and make it look nicer, but this is about all you are gonna do. So how exactly do we make this? Well, first, we're just gonna start by putting a quad in our draw path. So you'll like click here and you'll do like new quad mesh. And on the GitHub repository, you'll find a shader. So you're gonna want to hit new shader material under the geometry instance material override. And you're gonna hit new shader material. In here, you're gonna drag and drop my shader. And there'll be already be like preset values here. I'll explain what each one of them do, but that's basically all you have to do. And then the three textures, put them right here. So there'll be one called red, put that in the red slot. There'll be one called green, put that in the green slot, blue in the blue slot. And a noise texture, you're gonna come here, hit new noise texture like that, and then this will show up. And then you're gonna click on this and put new open simplex noise. Make sure seamless is checked, and you can toy around with this however you want. I've just left this kind of like that. So what we're going to do now is the fire color. This is about as close as I could get to Breath of the Wild's fire color. I just like took a screenshot, opened up Krita and got like the hex value of the fire. So this is about as close as I can get to that color, but this is generally going to be a fire color. And what I can do is actually kind of explain to you what this shader is doing. So if I set the speed scale to like 0.01 and I enable this, right? Or maybe 0.1 and stop it right there. Okay, so this is the fire phase. As you can see, all of the particles are billboarded, so they're actually going to follow our camera wherever we look. And you can sort of see that it just wobbles or warbles around and creates this sort of like fiery effect, right? And this is basically the green texture which I showed you from earlier. So I'll try to get that in view here. I think you can sort of see that these two are the same texture. And what it's actually doing is it's just multiplying this by our fire color to get our fire effect. But you might probably be wondering, how is it like self-aware that the longer it goes on, like if I resume the speed scale back, how is it self-aware that once it gets to this point, it just automatically turns into smoke? And it also fades out a bit more. And I'll get to that whole like sort of self-aware thing and how it does this and how it'll always extend to the lifetime of the particle. It's a really cool thing actually. Um, but yeah, the point is the further on the particle lifetime it goes, it's going to turn into this smoke. And the way it's doing this is it's basically just carrying out a linear interpolation where the starting of the particle is like fire. So it takes the fire texture, and as it goes on, it slowly sort of switches into the smoke texture. What it also does is, as the particle's lifetime goes on, the alpha clip or the alpha scissor, I think that's what it's called in Godot, the alpha scissor is increased, which means that compared to the start of the particle effect, you can see that more of the texture is sort of chopped out right here. And if I make this go on for a little longer, you can sort of see we come to this point where we're just left with these. So it sort of fades out into its own, like these singular little blobby particles. And that's what our third texture is doing, the blue texture, if you can remember this. You see these little points right here? That's what's making up these. And the rest of this is just cloud noise with polar coordinates applied to it. And what this is doing is basically it defines what the alpha is of our material. So if I go here and I set the alpha scissor to 0, right? You'll notice that this is what happens. If I set it to 0.1, however, you can sort of see the noise texture moving around. 0.2, and we're basically returned back to this point, but it's still a little artifacty, so I usually set it to like 0.23 to get rid of that extra sort of weird looking circular artifacts that you get if you set it like at 0.2. I mean, if this is what you want, you can go for it, sure. But I left it at 0.23, and so that's essentially what these three textures are doing. The way I made these was I just modeled it in Blender, and then I did some like movement in Krita. So I kind of just inverted it and did some color adjustment and stuff, made it a little more like toony, and then just applied a noise mask, cloud noise, which is just Perlin noise, polar coordinates, and just splotched on a few white blobs. Not that hard to actually make these textures, but yeah, and that's essentially what the shader is doing. But if you just slap this on and you start throwing your particles, right? So you create a process material, you disable the gravity, you set the emission shape to a sphere, and you start messing around with radial acceleration and make it go out. Nothing's actually going to happen to your particles. They're just going to stay as the smoke or the fire. I don't remember what was the default, but it's either going to stay as like the smoke or the fire throughout the entire lifetime of the particle. And so this is where that whole like self-aware thing comes. How is it actually determining when to switch from fire to smoke? And the cool thing is, I was actually doing a lot of research on ways I could transfer data from the particles material into the regular shader material, and I was looking at things where you'd have to write like instance custom and set custom data as like bytes or floats and some weird stuff with particle shaders, which I don't even fully understand myself. But I kind of just gave up on that because it was too complicated for something this simple. Eventually, though, I was watching certain that I was watching. I was trying to recreate another like particle effects in the game I'm currently working on, and I noticed that this color section or this hue variation, when I was moving it, it wasn't actually doing anything to my particles. I mean, here it is, and I guess that sort of foreshadows what's going on, but this sort of hue variation and color wasn't really doing anything to the particles effect. So I went to the docs and I started looking around to try and figure out why that's happening. And as I found out is that my particles effect was using colors in its fragment function, while this, both the color and hue variation, are actually set to the vertex color of each of the particle materials. And this immediately blew my mind, because when I came back here I realized that that's the perfect way I can transfer data between the particles material and the shader, and in sort of like an intuitive way. So all we're doing is we're just going to set a color ramp, right? I think if you don't have one, you'll get like this color option. But what you're trying to do is you want to go here and specify a color ramp. So you'll go here and hit new gradient texture. And let me just open this up full so you can see it. You'll create a new gradient, and this is what you want: 3 points, right? So you're just gonna click 3 times. So if you click right here, it'll create a new point. If you right click, it removes it. So you want 3 points, right? The first point, you're gonna set this to black with maximum alpha. Okay, and so what this is essentially the entire lifetime of the particle. So this here is the beginning where the particle is born, and this is the end where the particle dies. So at the beginning, when it's black, that indicates to my shader it should be in like completely smoke, like totally smoke texture. And at the end, you can see we're actually in maximum white. Over here, you can't really see it, but we're in maximum white. It's just that our alpha is 0, and I'll get to why that is. But we're in maximum sort of white over here. So what it's doing is that at the beginning of the particle's lifetime, it's smoke, and at the end it's sorry, at the beginning it's fire. Sorry, black is fire, and then white is smoke. So as we come to the end, it turns to smoke. If I put this down to black, you can see it returns back to the fire color, which is pretty cool, right? But the thing is, this would be just a linear gradient, which doesn't look right, because in explosion it'll start off with like a big ball of fire, and then immediately it'll like fade out into smoke. So that's what this third value is. The third value goes straight to white, as you can see, but it's sort of right here in the middle, and you can change the position of this. So the closer you move it to the left, the less time it's going to remain as fire, and the quicker it's going to turn to smoke. Whereas the more you move it towards the right, the longer it will stay as fire, and the longer it will take to turn to smoke. As for this alpha part, for the most part, it's just straight going from an alpha of 1. Oh, this is 255, but if you look at it in raw values, it's just 1, all the way to an alpha value of 0. And so what that's doing, I can actually show this to you, is at an alpha value of 1, we get basically the entire texture. And as it decreases, it's sort of cutting out more and more and more of the texture until we get this. And this is all the way at the very end of the lifetime of the particle. And that's about it. As for the rest of the particles material, is pretty simple. I've not actually done anything complicated here. So I'll just run through what each of these do. The emission shape is a sphere, because I don't want it to all start from one point. I want it to like start like at least a little bit spread out from each other to give it some like variation. The direction doesn't really matter. The direction actually doesn't matter. You can set this to whatever you want. The gravity is set to +3 on y. So what that's going to do is, over the lifetime of the particles, they're going to slowly move upwards. It's very subtle, you can't really notice it, but if you're far away and you watch the explosion, you might be able to tell that everything's moving like just in linear directions. So instead I put this gravity value, so it's sort of pulled upwards, like how smoke moves upwards when like how a smoke gas moves upwards. And radial acceleration is what really creates the whole explosion thing. So you can just use radial acceleration on its own like this. I'm not doing that. Instead, I set up an acceleration curve. You can use either one, but acceleration curve gives you more control over the acceleration. So it starts from a value of like I think 40 something, and it goes down to a value of 0. So that means it starts off with like a lot of radial acceleration, and then it gradually slows down as it gets towards the end. So it sort of like starts off with a big like boom, and then towards the end it just sort of like dampens and slows down. Uh, and you can just set this up however you want. You can do like these bending of the curves to create like more precise sort of movement. Or if you want, you can just stick to using regular acceleration. Just make sure nothing's in the acceleration curve slot, because that'll override whatever other stuff you have. So the radial acceleration is what really causes it to just spread out and move around. I think there's something else you have to do in order for a radial acceleration to work. I can't remember exactly. The angle just gives it a random angle when it starts. So set it to 720 and then put full randomness. So that means whenever it spawns, each like particle will start at a random rotation so that it doesn't look like all uniform and weird. The scale, you sort of play around with this as per your particles. This depends on how you set it up. For me, this scene, I kind of wanted to have like a scale of 3. You could go higher if you want. The bigger the scale is, the less particles you actually have to have. So you technically get more performance. But it also looks more like more tiling. I can't really explain it, but it looks like more obvious that it's the same texture repeated over and over again. Whereas if you have more particles with smaller scales, it's harder to tell that it's actually one texture. It kind of looks like they're all different stuff. And the color ramp I kind of already explained. So that is the basis for our explosion material, and I can just show this to you if I set our speed scale back. Yeah, I think, was it set to 3? I think, oh no, I think it must have been set to like 1.2 or something like that. I don't know, I'll figure it out at like the end of the video. But yeah, this is kind of like the whole explosion effect. You're gonna want to enable one shot if you're like if you don't want it to keep repeating over and over again because it's an explosion. And this timer and stuff is just for me to present it cinematically. I'm gonna shut that up because you guys can probably hear that from the recording. 1 second. Yeah. This timer and all this stuff is just set so I could do like the cinematics of this when I was showing it to you in the beginning. You don't need to set this up however you like. The other stuff are just extra. So now I'll just sort of go over the extra things that I did to make this look better. One is I added these embers. Again, I'll turn off one shot right here. And so this is what the embers do. You can sort of see they're just like spheres. And all they're doing is, again, it's just radial acceleration with gravity facing upwards, a little bit of initial velocity, and some scaling to them, right? And I've given it a scale curve. So they have a very small scale, but then in the scale curve, oh no, I did not mean to do that, undo that. In the scale curve, it just basically starts from max scale and then goes down to 0, which is how you can see it sort of becomes tinier as it goes upwards. So these are like little like embers which you can have just to add to the effect. And the last thing is this like boom boom thing which I have over here. This was completely unnecessary. This was just added because a guy on Reddit by the name of Herenic, I don't even know how to say that name. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I do not know how to say that name, but he gave me a really good reference video for Breath of the Wild explosions, and I sort of just saw that he told me like there were these like spark effects that come out. So I just pulled like this effect off of Sketchfab. I just found like a random explosion effect. You can make one in Blender as well. It's not too hard. And all it does is it's just this right here. I don't know if I can show you. Yeah, at this point, it's just this explosion effect, and I put a little shader on it so it's unshaded. It's got like this bright glow color to it, and yeah, that's about it. And so it starts off like this. Maybe if I can reduce the number over here, it starts off like this, and it's slowly like the shader just makes a circle from the center and makes it pop outwards. at 0.1 seconds, and then after that it sort of just fades out to nothingness. That's about it. It's a very simple effect, but it kind of gives it that little like pop for the effect you're trying to make. And this is the last one, the distortion sphere. So it is just again another shader. So it starts off kind of like this. So it just takes the screen UVs and just shifts them around using some noise. I'm not gonna go into how I made this because it's just its own shader kind of, and it's a little more complex. But I'm pretty sure there are many tutorials that show how to do like distortion with UVs and stuff. So it's the same thing. You just distort the screen UVs and then sample the screen texture, and you get this. And then again, I did the whole like circle from the center that pops outwards. So it kind of starts like this and then just reaches the end over there. And that's about it. So you just layer all of these effects one on top of the other. I need to make that invisible. Yeah, you layer all of these effects one on top of the other. Yeah, one on top of the other, and you get this effect. And yeah, you can sort of see this explosion effect. So you can see the little the boom happening there, and then it just fades out. You can see our smoke. It starts off with fire. It's a little hard to tell because it happens very quickly, but it starts off as fire and then eventually fades out to smoke. You can see our embers sort of flying out, and yeah, that's about it. That's how you create this effect. So the links to all the files and assets you need will be in the description on a GitHub page. And yeah, that's about it. Enjoy.